Right, welcome to this meeting about Christopher Hill, the Marxist historian of the English Revolution and one of the most significant historians from this country who died earlier this year. I'm Colin Wilson, I'm an IT worker from London and a Unison steward, and I'll be chairing the meeting. We have two speakers at the meeting. The first will be Brian Manning, who's written a number of books himself about the English Revolution, and who asked that I introduce him as a pupil of Christopher Hill, and he's going to speak first. And then John Rees, who is a leading member of the SWP and the editor of the International Socialism Journal, will speak. They'll both speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. We won't be using the speaker slip system, so people can just put up their hands after the speakers have finished their introductions. So, first of all, Brian Manning.
Can I be heard all right? At the back there. Actually, I asked to be introduced as a pupil of Christopher Hill, not out of just sentimentality, but for a more self-regarding reason. Because I am always labelled as a pupil of Christopher Hill, in book after book, publication after publication, after period. Now, Christopher Hill had dozens of pupils. The most distinguished historians of the era. I mean, Gerald Aylmer and Ivan Roots and Donald Pennington and Keith Thomas and so forth. But none of them are ever described as pupils of Christopher Hill. Why was I described as a pupil of Christopher Hill? I'm afraid it was not for a very nice reason. And it was very successful. As a result of always being called a pupil of Christopher Hill, I was A, labelled a communist, and B, labelled a Marxist. And that was the purpose of using this label. Now, we talk about fighting for the English Revolution. As I said yesterday to John, the people who actually fought for the English Revolution, and 100,000 of them died, they died in the 17th century, and I'm sure Christopher will want that pointed out. But we are too defensive about the English Revolution. We talk about reviving the English Revolution. We talk about as if it was something that had died and needed to be brought back into life. What I want to do today is to celebrate the English Revolution. I want to celebrate the life of Christopher Hill, but it is so identical with the English Revolution that to celebrate Christopher Hill involves celebrating the English Revolution. Now, why should we celebrate the English Revolution? When Christopher Hill started writing on the English Revolution, it was entirely about the aristocracy and the gentry. Christopher Hill, painstakingly over years, reintroduced the mass of the people into the English Revolution, the little people, in numerous different ways. And we can never actually see the English Revolution in that same way again because of that popular range of people that Christopher introduced into it. Now, why should we celebrate the English Revolution? It invented mass popular politics. It wasn't invented by any aristocrats. It wasn't invented by John Milton. It wasn't even invented by John Lilburne or Gerard Winstanley. It emerged spontaneously in the streets in 1641, when the mass of people in London poured out in the streets, first of all to demonstrate against the Earl of Strafford, later to demonstrate against bishops and the king. This developed very rapidly from spontaneous movements in the street into the basic pattern of popular democracy. First of all, it is organized around a petition. A petition is important educative role because it sets out the reasons for the protest, the reasons for the policy. the people are invited to sign the petition, thus commit themselves to the movement. And then, in the third phase, they march with the petition to Parliament and demonstrate in support of the petition outside Parliament. All this was actually developed by the artisans of London. I would call them the working people, and I would call it offensive if I called them the working class. But they were the working people of London, and they developed mass popular politics for the first time in the history of the world. Secondly, the byproduct of this was the Leveller movement, who introduced into world history the first written constitution. This is still celebrated in North America, but we seem to have almost forgotten it here. And the point about a written constitution is for the first time it based power on the people. Power rises from the mass of the people. The constitution should arise from the mass of the people. That's why it was called the Agreement of the People. And it gives the people rights. The concept of mass movement holding rights was developed in the English Revolution. Now, Christopher Hill devoted most of his career to, in fact, writing religious history. It comes as a bit of a puzzle to many of us. Every book he wrote deals with different aspects of the religion of the people of the period. One thing that he thought was that there had been too much emphasis on economic causes of the Civil War, and there had been insufficient emphasis on the ideas and the ideology. And he wrote numerous books on the ideas, the ideology of the English Revolution. But let us think what this was actually about. Before 1640, up until 1640 when the revolution breaks out, everybody in Britain is obliged by law to belong to the Church of England. And they're punished if they don't belong to the Church of England. What would be regarded as the mass media was entirely controlled by the Church. The people who had most contact were preachers in the parish church. The preacher was licensed by the bishop, by the church. Books were licensed by the bishops. The entire communication system was controlled by the church. The church was the most oppressive institution imaginable. It hasn't all that much changed, has it? The struggle during the English Revolution was for what is called religious toleration. But Christopher Hill pointed out that that is the wrong term. Toleration implies some right handed out from above. Here's the law, but you can break the law in these respects. We will tolerate you if you do that. It's an exemption. It's a privilege that people have. Christopher said what it was about was liberty of conscience. And the English Revolution won liberty of conscience. And we have to think of the enormity of that. The whole oppressive regime had collapsed. And how had it collapsed? It hadn't been overthrown by the aristocracy and gentry. It hadn't even been overthrown by the levellers. It had been overthrown by the little people, who demanded the right to worship according in the light of their own conscience, to be able to read the things that they wanted to read, to be able to talk about the things they wanted to talk about. Now, not all the people, but there were people who, for example, would walk 20 miles across country to attend an illegal religious service. One only has to look at, for example, the young John Lilburne 19 or 20 years old, of an apprentice in London who was convicted of importing heretical books. And he was whipped through the streets of London. Now, I don't understand why Blunkett hasn't discovered about that. I mean, you could convert bus lanes into whipping lanes. But it was a very effective and cheap method. But what made Lincoln distinct was that while he was being lashed, and people would get 30, 100, people died under the whip. He talked the whole time. He made speech after speech. Now, or think of the Quakers being dragged by their hair across Palace Yard, which we have a little bit left of Parliament Square, but it was much bigger then, and so forth. These people had to actually fight every way for their beliefs. And they won in 1660. The Church of England did not regain its monopoly. People gained the right, with disadvantages, I agree, but they gained the right to base the worship according to their own rights. This means that what they established was freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly. That's where it all comes from. It comes from those religious battles. It's got nothing to do with anything happening in the 18th or 19th century. It had been won. Now, whereas I would be quite pleased to blow up most of the cathedrals in when they talk of them as heritage sites, the real heritage are those little backstreet chapels where the people, in fact, put their pennies together to build themselves a free worshipping place. No freedom ever emerged from a cathedral. It emerged from the nonconformist chapels, as did much of the finest literature of the period. One thinks of Bunyan and so forth. So we have enormous number of reasons to celebrate the English. We have an even further reason, which may be slightly more controversial. Christopher Hill wrote a book called Liberty Against the Law. It's a theme he had always, and he points out that nothing was ever won in English history except by fighting for it. Nothing. You had to fight for trade union rights. You had to fight every inch of the way. Nothing was ever granted freely by the ruling class. It always had to be fought for. And that is what the English Revolution is all about. It's about people fighting for their rights. Now, Christopher worked over a very long period. He worked in a period of constant controversy. But the controversy was always directed at Christopher Hill, often in a very sort of personal way. I would like to say this, that, for example, when the American historian J.H. Hexter came over for a sabbatical in Oxford, Christopher befriended him, Christopher gave him hospitality, Christopher looked after him when he had a heart attack. When Hexter got back across the Atlantic, he wrote the most virulent and malicious attack on Christopher Hill. And what I would like to say is that those things did actually hurt Christopher. He wasn't immune to those sort of attacks, and he suffered them throughout his life. Many of these malicious, vicious, personal attacks, they weren't reviews. They were attacks on Christopher Hill. And one who can see a book that is called Fabricating the English Revolution, what it's saying is that Christopher Hill made it up. He invented it. And nobody complains about this. Nobody has burnt the book, as far as I know. They have got away with this criticism of Christopher Hill. Christopher Hill was, of course, a most dedicated and scrupulous scholar. And Christopher Hill never invented any history. He moved with the times. it is obviously a great point if we relate Christopher Hill's earliest writing, 1940, to his later writings. But Christopher Hill acknowledged that he had changed his opinion on a number of major aspects. One was on women's history. He thinks the thing that shamed him most was that he had spent much of his working life ignoring the role of women in history. We often quote, I've often heard and Marxism quoted, the famous statement by Rainsborough, "The poorest he that is in England has a right to live as the greatest he." And Christopher, I never particularly noticed that it does say he, and he meant he. The rights of freeborn English men, they meant men. And it has involved fundamental rethinking of the English Revolution to recognize that these much admired radicals like Rainsborough were only thinking of rights for men. They were also only thinking of rights for English men. Now, the second thing that Christopher said that had influenced him most was the development of history from below. And he, in fact, contributed a great deal to that. There is, though, a problem, and it remains a problem for many of us, that in the 1970s and 80s, Christopher Hill abandoned the original interpretation, people say the original Marxist interpretation, that the Civil War was a class conflict between a declining feudal aristocracy and a rising capitalist bourgeoisie. Christopher Hill abandoned the bourgeoisie. And he argued that what made it a bourgeois revolution was not the presence of the bourgeoisie, because there wasn't the bourgeoisie, but the fact that it facilitated the transition to capitalism. So there was a fundamental shift in his attitude towards the notion of bourgeoisie, a bourgeois revolution, a different concept of bourgeois revolution, one that facilitated the transition to capitalism rather than one in which the bourgeoisie was agent of capitalism. I had some doubts about some of this, and I don't think that anybody has fully solved this problem of the conception of the English Revolution of a bourgeois revolution. But there were certain things which I would perhaps draw slightly more attention to than Christopher Hill did. One was the growth of wage labour in the economy. Another was the stress on everybody having a right to do what they wanted with their own. Therefore, the denial of communal ownership of land, to accept land should be parcelled up amongst individuals. Each individual should have the right to do exactly what was most profitable then. But perhaps most important, and he did touch on this, was that the English Revolution established black slave labour in the British colonies and the slave trade. That wasn't something that happened, as has been suggested by other people, after the Restoration. It was something that happened during the English Revolution, and it also introduced the notion of white supremacy. That when Parliament debated the question of slavery in the West Indies, they said that the white servants often are called slaves, but they can't be slaves because they're white. Only blacks can be slaves. So this was, I think, these 3 points were essential to the notion that the English Revolution contributed to the transition to capitalism. But that is what I don't want to get away from the fact that the English Revolution at the same time was an enormously progressive force in the sense of establishing freedom of thought, freedom of worship, in the sense of establishing notions which continuously exist from 1660. You only got to look at the exclusion crisis, that the same demonstrations that had taken place in the English Revolution, petitions, mass marches and so forth, were taking place everywhere. Thanks. So we have this mixed picture of the English Revolution. Can we ever solve all these problems? I don't think we can. But what we should not do is admit that the English Revolution didn't matter, or that it was just a blip. 20 years the English Revolution lasted. Masses of people in 1660 had lived virtually their entire mature lives during the Revolution. It had introduced such enormous changes. For example, it did abolish the monarchy and the House of Lords. Have you abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords? I mean, you know.
Not yet.
No, but it's taking a long time, isn't it? But they actually did it. And if you think of the enormity of what they did, and January the 30th, if we had a national day, it probably should be January the 30th, when Charles was executed. But think of the enormity. Here was a king who was regarded as semi-divine, who got his authority from God, and they said, in the name of the people, we're going to convict you of treason. I mean, you're going to have treason before then against the king, but now you could have treason against the people. Now, it may be that this was a minority of the people, but you couldn't actually get away from that. This was an incredible act to accuse and publicly try a king for treason against the people and then publicly execute him. The enormity of what happened during the Revolution is a matter broadly for celebration. Why? Because the people who did this were mostly the little people. They weren't Prince Rupert and the Cavaliers. They weren't even Cromwell and the Ironsides. They were artisans, comparatively poor peasant farmers, who, for a brief period, took power into their own hands. And this is my final point. What enabled them to do this? One was basic assumption of all radicals in this revolution, that power corrupts. All power corrupts. The level of leaders says, if we won power, we would be corrupted too. We have to establish a system which stops people being corrupted by power. We haven't done much about that, have we, really? But that was a basic principle of the level of constitution. The other point was that the main reason why people accepted the system, and they knew it was wrong, the system, they knew they suffered under the system. The reason they accepted it was because they didn't think they could change it. And the main thing, again, in the radicals of the revolution is that the little people thought briefly for a period, and they included women, they included apprentices and so forth, they thought they could actually change the world. And briefly, they did change the world. So we have a lot, I think, again, to learn from those 2 points, that power corrupts and the people can actually change the world.
Thanks, Brian. Now, John Rees.
Okay, I think the death of Christopher Hill earlier this year is an enormous loss, really, and Christopher Hill was a frequent guest here at Marxism, and it's quite proper that we spend some time just to, and I think Brian quite rightly said, to celebrate both the English Revolution and Christopher Hill, because his name is so closely associated with the reappropriation and explanation of that revolution. And I want to talk a little bit about why he was so hugely successful at that, because his name is simply one of the best known historians in the world, and it is inseparable from the modern understanding of the English Revolution. And I think one of the reasons why he was such a brilliant historian, and such a popular historian, I mean, he was popular way beyond the ranks of academia, popular with precisely the modern inheritors of the people who made the revolution in the way that Brian described them. And I think that standing, that authority, came at least in part from this sentiment. He said, if there's any point in studying history at all, its object is to help understanding the past in order to control the present. Bad history will lead to bad politics. And it was that commitment to historical understanding as something which would aid people now in shaping their present, which I think gave him both the kind of scholarly drive to get it right and the equal determination to make it appealing and understandable by all sorts of readers of his works and people listening to his lectures. And it precisely, I think, catches people's imagination because he did have that ability not to reject or push aside what happened in the establishment in terms of political development, not to underestimate what happened in terms of long-term social and economic change, but to make those things revolve around the experiences and actions of ordinary people. I was thinking, actually, as Brian was talking about Palace Yard and saying that part of what was Palace Yard is Parliament Square, and it made me think actually of something that's just happened really in the course of the anti-war movement, and it's a minor detail. I've never spoken about it in a meeting. I've never heard anybody in any of the Stop the War Coalition meetings speaking about it either. But actually, something a little bit remarkable, at any rate, has happened in the course of that movement. It has been the case, as long as I've been politically active, and as long as I've known anybody organising demonstrations in this country, to be an absolute rule maintained as law by the police that you can't demonstrate in Parliament Square while Parliament is sitting, and you aren't allowed to carry banners or placards in Parliament Square. That's been simply the law as far as the police were concerned, and imposed on all demonstrations that I've been on. That simply got swept away in the course of the last year. There have been huge demonstrations, people blocking the road, placards all the time, banners all the time in the course of this movement. And indeed, Brian Hall, the individual peace protester who's there in Parliament Square, won a court case against people who tried to push him out, and he's now there by right. And this now annoys MPs because they say that he's too noisy, and there is now 40 MPs who signed an early day motion asking for him to be removed, in effect, after the movement to try and re-establish the status quo ante in terms of the practice of the police. And I think Christopher Hill was the kind of historian that we would want, because he noticed those kind of things. He recorded those kind of things. He took them to be significant. He noticed the shift from one moment to the next, and then the attempt to reclaw the ground on the part of the authorities. And his books are full of that kind of detail, which very many other historians, and many Marxist historians, I think, would pass over without marking them or marking their significance. And I think that's one of the reasons why he is both such a good historian and such a widely read and popular historian, because he noticed those things. And I think that there was something about his political formation that that brought him to those kinds of conclusions. He was always absolutely insistent about the centrality of his participation in the Communist Party historians group to his intellectual formation. It was, I think, a critical experience in that it fused the experience of looking back at the past, of writing about the past and current politics. And it also gave him, I think, a model which he later much missed of collective discussion. Lee Humber and I did an interview with him some years ago, which was published in International Socialism, in which we asked him we said, would you agree that it's political organisation that gives you that total outlook on history rather than academic training? And he said, yes. The best academic historical training I ever got was from the historians group of the Communist Party, where we discussed all of this, science and revolution, literature and revolution, and so on. That gave me the sort of education that all historians ought to have. It showed me that all individual aspects of history are linked. It's very difficult when you study the personal letters of a gentleman from Bedfordshire in 1642 to spot the wider implications and references. They are there, but you have to be on the lookout for them. And I think it was that participation, that political participation, which sharpened that ability, that desire to look out for those things and record them. I think he said that he would dearly have wished later to have the same collective experience of discussing his writing and his ideas that he had at that time in the Communist Party historians group. Of course, he left the Communist Party in 1956, as so many people did over the invasion of Hungary. But I think he missed that. He didn't think that it was, even in the Communist Party, that was a particularly restrictive thing. He thought that the Communist Party historians group was, a space where the kind of authority of the party structure didn't really intrude. He was always very warm about Donator, who we regarded as the person with closest links to the King Street headquarters of the Communist Party. But he said it was a fantastically empowering relationship. He said of Donator, he said, she was a marvellous historian and the least likely party dictator of anyone I have ever known. The most severe thing she ever said to me was when she saw that I committed some terrible political deviation. She said, I think, comrade, this has not yet reached its final formulation. Which is a phrase which I'm going to keep for future use, actually. So I think this was an important point of formation, and I think that he said he saw himself, and he saw the 1930s actually as a period when he thought that finally the kind of inevitable progress of British history towards parliamentary representation simply broke down as an idea, and that he believed that the formation, that his political formation at that time gave him a particular point of vantage to look back on the English Revolution, and I think that stayed with him. It was the initial impetus to replace or to argue with the Whig interpretation of history, that notion of kind of linear progress, which was a point of departure. I still think that the first pamphlet he wrote, The English Revolution 1640, is an absolute model of historical writing. Its clarity, its brevity, its clear-sightedness, whatever you might want to argue about its judgments, I don't think you can take away from it that. And I think it's an absolutely undervalued art to be able to express serious ideas with that kind of brevity and plainness of language. And I think the fact that that pamphlet is still, even now, read so widely is a tribute to that ability that Christopher Hill had. I think it is true, as Brian says, that later he became much more interested in the role of ideas and so forth. But he put the framework there in the Century of Revolution. I think the kind of textbook format of it is sometimes less attractive than some of the later things that he wrote. But it's there, and it's very powerful, and it's absolutely worth reading in, from Reformation to Revolution and the century of Revolution. And I think that the explorations that he later made were assuming that kind of framework. And there is so much that's absolutely brilliant to read. The World Turned Upside Down, God's Englishman, his semi-biography of Cromwell are absolutely outstanding books. And I think some of the Liberty Against the Law, which was not simply about the English Revolution but about a wider historical period, are fantastic books. And I would urge anybody who hasn't read any or all of them to do so, because there's an enormous penetration and things which are now taken as axiomatic in historical study, which he really laid out fully and completely, and that's why I think that whatever else the English tradition has given to the Marxist movement, its outstanding contribution is its historical writing, and Christopher Hill is one of the great exponents of that. I think when you look at the way in which he persisted in defending that Marxist interpretation, I mean, he says himself that he moved away from using some of the jargon. I think first of all he thought it was a barrier to his ideas being accepted more widely. But the framework is undoubtedly there. He actually worried in the interview that we did with him that, as he put it, sometimes dropping the words, dropping the language could lead to you dropping the ideas, and he obviously was concerned about that, and we could debate the degree to which that was true. But I think when you see his reaction, for instance, to the revisionist challenge, which came later, the insistence on defending a social and economic interpretation, a broad market interpretation of the revolution, he stuck to that when it was becoming deeply unfashionable to do so. And Brian mentioned the incredible vitriol which was directed at him in some of the personal attacks. And so I think we see here somebody who was formed in a particular tradition and stuck, no matter what political or organisational affiliations he had, to that tradition until the end. It was terrific to see him here, really, at Marxism, still arguing through those ideas in the book and giving such close attention to the individual figures who made the revolution, to the ideas, and there's an enormous cultural breadth as well. If you read, what he wrote about, the book on John Milton, but the essays on Andrew Marvell, the essays on the spread of scientific ideas, the connections that he makes between the literature, the poetry, the scientific advances of the 17th century and the English Revolution, you do really have here someone who not just had a commitment to history from below, not simply somebody who'd worked through an economic framework, but somebody who was capable of elaborating that, of making the connections without crudeness, without reducing them to the economic or political framework, but nevertheless making them alive in terms of the whole cultural world in which from which the English Revolution emerged, and which it then completely altered and created for the rest of the 17th century. So I think there's an absolutely enormous amount to celebrate in Christopher Hill's writing. I think the temptation perhaps to rest on your laurels after such a productive career must have been enormous, and he didn't do it. The temptation not to. I don't think he was a person that courted controversy. He simply wrote, and the controversy came to him. But when it did, he didn't duck the argument. He didn't duck the argument with the revisionists. He didn't go on and on about it, but he didn't duck it. He didn't duck it either. And I think that ability is an enormous kind of bequest to anybody in the Marxist movement, and certainly anybody who wants to, to write seriously about history. So I think that those are such enormous strengths that they're very worthwhile celebrating. I think perhaps some of the things that we now need to think about, if we think about a legacy and developing it, or we think about contribution and how it can be built on. I think I'm not going to go on about this for fear of embarrassing Brian, but I do think that his body of work has begun to address the question which Christopher Hill raised but didn't solve, about the question of agency and class in the revolution in his later writings. What Brian's written about the middling sort, which is it's a very cunning way of actually dealing with this problem, since it uses a contemporary term and therefore is not open to the objection that you're imposing some Marxist category from outside, but clearly occupies that function inside Brian's account of the revolution. Is an enormously important starting point, and the single most important building block that we have after Hill's own writing. I do think what we need to consider is how, out of that sort of moment of formation, we can re-establish a tradition of historical writing which is as precise, as scholarly, as difficult to refute because of its close adhesion to the historical record, and at the same time as popular and accessible as Christopher Hill's writing is. There are too many long books and not enough short, clear analyses of the way that things are. There are too many books filled with jargon and not enough plainly written and excitingly written, and yet resting on the historical record as the work of Christopher Hill. And his passing is an enormous loss from that kind of tradition, and it's something which anybody beginning any work, any serious work, can sit down, can look at, and can learn from.
Thanks, John. As I said before, we're not using the speak slip system, so if people could just put up their hands. Can people come to the mic, because the meeting is being taped? They'll have 3 minutes. I'll tap on the mic after 2, and after 3, can you wind up? The comrade with the pink shirt, and then Alex Koenigs.
Yes, I think one thing Christopher Hill did was open up the whole quest for our history. The history most of us in our lives have been denied, because when I was at school, certainly didn't learn anything about our history. It was all about kings and bishops. Mind you, Guardian this morning is all about bishops, I notice anyway. But basically, it's how do we get our history? How do we also get it into schools? And so we learn about ourselves. I was lucky enough to be training at a college of education in Oxford when Christopher Hill was writing, and until then I'd had Elton and Rouse and people, and Christopher Hill was a breath of fresh air. But it is about where is our history. I'm a gay man. I mean, where is my history? Where is the history? We didn't just appear in England in 1967. You know, nobody when I was at school said a lot of the great artists and sculptors of the Renaissance were gay. Nobody told me that Prince Rupert rode into the Battle of Edge Hill on horseback with a white poodle he called Boy. Not that I want to identify myself with Prince Rupert, by the way. And anyway, if I rode into a schoolyard on horseback with a white poodle, the kids would just take the piss anyway, and rightly so. But you know, it is the quest to learn about our history and make it live, and that it's not dry and dull as it was for me so often. And you know, there's a lot of it out there. I think Brian mentioned this whole business of like people before 1640, or was it 1641, having to go to church, the Anglican Church. But delve into that as well, as I was lucky enough to do, by looking at some of what ordinary people call the bawdy court records, but what the church authorities call the peculiar courts. Just as funny a word, really, when you think about it. These were the courts where the church wardens and the priests sat in judgment over people and their behavior in church. Yes, people had to go to church, but it wasn't an easy ride. Church services were often a shambles. When I looked at the bawdy court records of what people were doing in a church service, and this is the 1580s, and the church is Stratford-on-Avon. Okay, people were mooning, they were farting, they were going to sleep, they were snoring, they were playing dice, they were playing cards. Okay, and this expression that kept coming up, they were a common rumbler. You can see them all sitting there. They didn't want to be there. They were going rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb during the church service. Don't think that those people were docile. They weren't. They were making it a shambles. And that is actually our history. And that is what we should have learnt about all our lives.
I want to talk about the vilification of Christopher Hill that Brown mentioned. I wasn't fortunate enough to be a pupil of Christopher's, but I was a student at the college he was master of in Oxford in the 1970s, and I feel in all sorts of ways personally indebted to him. When I got into a bit of a scrape, he helped to get me out of it, apart from anything else. Political scrape, of course. And the vilification was quite disgusting. A few years ago, there's a man called Mark Kishlansky, who's a particularly obnoxious revisionist historian, who wrote an attack on Christopher in the London Review of Books, which was headlined Rolodex Man. And the reason why it was called Rolodex Man was because one of his complaints about Christopher Hill was that the trouble with his writing was that it was full, he had this massive array of quotations from the primary literature, all the pamphlets and so on that were produced during the English Revolution. So whatever Christopher asserted about what had happened during the English Revolution, he could always produce these quotes to support him. In other words, the complaint is, bastard, he's not only a Marxist, but he knows more than us. That was the level at which they had to attack him. And even after he died, it was the same. The Times, the day after Christopher died, carried an article from some worm, some creepy historian from somewhere in London, who claimed to be able to expose that Christopher was a communist mole inside MI5, which he served in for a portion of the Second World War. Now, this man was a moron, this historian. I think he was at Brunel, or is at Brunel. Christopher Hill, John referred to it. In 1940, Christopher Hill wrote a pamphlet on the English Revolution, which is a pioneering Marxist study of the English Revolution. It was in the public record. He was well known as a member of the Communist Party when he was a student at Oxford. If MI5 didn't know this, well, it just confirms all we know about the competence of British intelligence. In the current row about the BBC and so on and so forth, they keep on talking about not compromising the high standards of British intelligence. Well, if you look over the years, one can say a lot about the high standards of British intelligence. But I think that the important thing, and Brown said we let this happen. I wrote a letter to the Times, which was possibly libelous, which may be why they didn't publish it. So I did try, but it didn't succeed. I think the important thing is the vilification has failed. Christopher's books have an enormous readership, not simply in this country, around the world. He's had an enormous intellectual influence, which will be a benchmark for anyone who wants to understand what happened in England and indeed Europe in the 17th century. And anyone who hasn't read his books, I urge you to do so. The World Turned Upside Down is one of the great works of Marxist history. Just to read it is an enormously liberating experience. The final point I want to make is this. Christopher died a few days after the demonstrations on the 15th of February, and I understand that in his final years he suffered from Alzheimer's, so he won't have been aware of what happened. But you can imagine how happy he would have been to know about 2 million people marching down Whitehall, marching past the site where Charles Stuart, the man of blood, was executed. He would have been delighted to know that the good old cause was still alive.
If there are more people who want to speak, can they indicate, please?
Yeah, history within schools is definitely an ideological battleground. When there was the debates about the national curriculum, when the Tories were trying to introduce the national curriculum, there was a huge struggle about what the curriculum should look like in terms of history. And the Tories and the government certainly did not get it all their own way. History teachers and other educationalists were able to fight for things that I would defend. For example, the Tories definitely wanted to keep the teaching of history narrowly focused on British history, whereas educationalists said, no, this is absurd, we must broaden it out and look at global history, at world history. And I think that Christopher Hill and people like Brian Manning have certainly had an influence in the way in which the English Revolution is taught. I think it would probably be passed over if it wasn't for the work of people like Christopher Hill. If you look at some of the school textbooks, some of them are very good, but some of them are dreadful. Oxford history textbook, for example, has something like 2, maybe 3 pages on the English Revolution with a couple of exercises. It has something like 4, 5, 6 pages of portraits of Elizabeth I for the children to analyse. So, I mean, I know Brian's not a great fan of history teaching in schools, but I think thanks to the work of people like Brian, it is at least taught. I mean, most history teachers, I think, in schools put a great deal of emphasis on teaching the English Revolution, more so than the textbooks like the Oxford history would. And perhaps one of the best experiences I had of teaching history in school was dealing with the English Revolution. I was showing the film Cromwell. I tend to show the film Cromwell and show a bit of the film, and then we'll do a bit of analysis and a few exercises. And we got to the bit where there's the court case and Charles is going to be executed. And just as we get to the point before the execution, the bell goes for break, and normally the kids are straight out the door. In this case, they were absolutely still in the seats. So I said, well, look, the bell's gone. Do you want to go? No, we want to just see the end of the film. So I kept the film running, and at the moment the guillotine came down, there was absolute pandemonium in the classroom, great big cheers, and I really didn't think I'd been particularly partisan in the way I've taught it. They just seemed to instinctively identify with the revolutionaries.
Okay, the comrade in the green shirt at the back, and then the comrade in the denim jacket. Oh, more people now. Cheers.
Paul's just reminded me there of one of the ways in which we were taught history at school, because, I mean, Paul certainly wasn't my teacher. It wasn't him that showed us the film, but I remember being shown, I think it's Richard Harris that plays Cromwell, isn't it? Yeah. And for years afterwards, I can never remember much about the kind of politics of the thing, but I always remember the bit where the king got his head cut off. And it was round about the 1980s punk and that kind of stuff, and it stuck with us wonderfully. And I think, for me, the thing about Christopher Hill was not that he imposed the present on the past, but was able to use the present to help you understand the past. I remember going to his meeting on the English Bible and the English Revolution, and going to the meeting and kind of thinking it was a strange title and not really understanding what this meeting was going to be about. And he went, and I remember the example he used. He said, look, the Russian Revolution, you had the Communist Manifesto to guide you. In the French Revolution, they had, Thomas Paine and the Rights of Man. what do you think they had in the English Revolution? What do you think? You know, and he then went on to explain the battle over the types of the Bibles that were being read, which highlighted the conflicts that were taking place in society. Remember the example I used? Look, there was no equivalent of socialist worker. There was no paper called, I think it was a small petty bourgeois producer. He said, you know, there wasn't a paper called that at the time, and went on there to explain, you know, how, like John was talking about, those details that you have to look for can highlight a bigger picture. And a couple of years ago, I went to see Tony Benn and Roy Bailey do their gig in Glasgow. You know, when they do about the history of the Labour movement. And there must have been 2,000 people sat there listening. And I thought it was fantastic because I mean, Tony Benn and Roy Bailey use a lot of the things that Christopher Hill has dug up, and historians like him over the years, to kind of enlighten us to the past, but also to guide us for the present. There was 2,000 people there, and I thought that was fantastic, you know. And I think it was 2,000 people of the Labour movement and old Labour and that kind of stuff. But what cheered me up even more when I was talking to somebody last night who'd been at Glastonbury and said they'd been to exactly the same concert, yet there were 1,000 20, 21-year-olds listening to Roy Bailey and Tony Benn and picking up, you know, the same kind of things. I'm sure they got their biggest cheer when the king got his head off. You can see the importance of the battle over history. I mean, I can't remember the quote. Is it from 1984 about those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. I think you could take that too literally, because those who control the present, if that's the total case, then there's no chance of changing the future. But I think the point's important. The battle over our history is very important because it's what guides us to fighting in the future. And Christopher Hill, I think, made an absolutely massive contribution to that.
Okay, after John, you sing The Woman in the Black T-shirt.
Yeah, an anecdote first of all. My mother left school when she was 15 and has worked, you know, all her life. She retired when she was 70, which I understand we've all got to look forward to in the future. But you know, when she retired, she decided she'd get some educational qualifications, as you do, you know, and she did some GCSEs, and now she's doing English A-level. And she had to read a play by Carol Churchill. And, you know, I don't know whether you've had this experience, but it can be very boring with your mother doing A-level English, and every time you go round the house, you know, she wants to discuss it with you, and this is not necessarily what you want yourself. And we went round there for dinner one day, and all the family are there having dinner. You know, she's cooked this lovely dinner, and she doesn't serve it up. She says, "Here, you must hear this." And out she pulls The World Turned Upside Down and starts reading extracts from it that have really impressed her. Now, to my mind, you know, this is... I mean, when I read the book, first of all, it blew me away. And to find your mum, I mean, she's 77 now, discovering The World Turned Upside Down and being blown away by it as well, I think is absolutely, you know, the best testimony that you can have, really, to the qualities that Christopher Hill possessed. The other point I'd make, really, is that, you know, there is a history war going on, if you like. I don't know whether Brian would agree, but I think in universities, at any rate, you know, that Hill is very much someone who, in most history departments, is not considered to be up to date, or I don't know, you know, whatever you want to say about it. It's old hat. This is Marxist old hat. And I think in most history departments, certainly the one I work in, the people who teach this period are very dismissive of Christopher Hill. You know, there's a history war going on. What we have to do, of course, is not just defend Hill, but build on Hill as well. You know, this is something that we absolutely have to do as well. We can't just rely on the works that Christopher Hill produced. You know, there have got to be Marxist historians producing works that build on Hill, that continue these history wars, and that, you know, re-establish the reputation of one of the greatest historians that we've ever had in this country.
The next speaker will be this comrade and then the comrade at the back in the middle.
So one thing I remember about teaching history at school was the English Revolution. What happened? Next thing, we're on to the Cold War. So getting slightly yeah, that's what happened to the rest of history. So I started reading a little bit myself and sort of found out a bit more about it, and then found out a bit more about later history as well, and actually finding that if you understand what's going on today is by reading what went on in the past, because otherwise you sort of like kind of get lost. The one thing is I've actually come to Marxism determined not to buy any more books. I think I'm going to be tracking up to bookmarks now.
This comrade will be followed by the comrade in the black shirt over there, and if anyone else wants to speak, then do indicate while this comrade's speaking.
Yeah, because the war on history is a bit more profound than just an attack on Hill, because Charles Clarke had his way. I think there'd be one small institution somewhere that'd be teaching history, and the rest of it would be banned, I think. And in some ways, early modern history is that same effect is actually happening in terms of the reduction of courses and the ability to take A-levels. My son's had to fight, really, to actually to argue, I don't know, he managed to do it with the local college and so on, that they actually would run a course on that rather than just go over again the modern history of the rise of the Nazi Party and so on all over again. And I think it's really essential that the glory that we have in terms of English history and so on, that's actually put by people like Hill and Manning and so on, is actually there for people to actually study, and we actually need to defend not just that point of view, but the actual ability even to actually come to terms with that and deal with that as well. And the other thing I want to mention really is the actual real ability, if you like, sometimes to get insights in things that happen. I remember once going to a meeting where the question was really whether the masses in London had any effect on what was going behind the walls of the House of Lords and the House of Commons in 1640. And it just suddenly occurred to me that once upon a time, suddenly, after a few dockers had been put inside for breaking the law and so on, over going on strike and defending their jobs and so on, suddenly a figure called the official solicitor was suddenly dragged out. And it was nothing to do with anything else that happened in the rest of the country at all. It just happened behind the walls of wherever the official solicitor actually hangs out now. That might be Harriet Harman now, I don't know. But I don't know where her office is. But only in that office did that actually happen. Nothing else outside happened, dealt with that at all. And I think most of the insights going backwards and forwards and so on is both refresh our movement and actually have the insight that goes backwards as well. And I think that's something that we can learn from what Hill gave us there.
Comrade here will be followed by the team member over by the wall.
I think touching on that problem that Brian raised in his contribution about the way in which Hill's idea of the bourgeois revolution changed in the course of his work. In the first pamphlet, it's very clear he talks about a very conscious bourgeoisie organising the independents and Ironsides and so on. Then we get his later books, Change and Continuity, in 17th century England, and an essay he wrote called The Bourgeois Revolution, ? That appeared about 1980. He's talking, as Brian said, more about the process of revolution opened up or allowed capitalist development to take place, but it wasn't a conscious process at all. Now, I have a question for both contributors, and that's why do you think he made that shift? What was affecting him that made him change his position? I don't think it's that the later position is indefensible. In fact, I think if you can actually see that there is a way in which if you're an absolutist state in which economics, politics, religion are all bound up together, if you destroy the state which preserves the feudal system, then you're going to allow capitalism to develop, assuming it's there in the first place, without that necessarily being your conscious intention. But I do think that Hill did exaggerate the lack of conscious intention that was involved in the 1640s and 50s. And it may not be entirely clear from what people said or did in England, but I'm a historian of Scotland, and if you actually read what Cromwell, Broghill, Colonel John Jones had said about Scotland, it's quite clear they do a very conscious class position on the nobility and feudalism. And what they actually said when they got there was, apart from, oh my God, what is this awful place kind of thing, was, we have to destroy these people. They are holding down the development of the economy here. And quite clearly say this. And actually, Hill himself quotes Colonel Jones and I think it's from Reformation to Industrial Revolution to this effect. So he was aware that people had a conscious view of destroying feudalism as a project. I mean, Cromwell says the same things in his letters and so on. So it's curious in a way that he took such a position that this is a kind of, not exactly an accident, but it's something, it's an outcome which wasn't intended towards the end of his life. I mean, obviously, when you get to 1688, 89, then clearly you do have a conscious project on behalf of the agrarian mercantile bourgeoisie to destroy absolutism, and quite consciously attempting to do it without involving the lower orders, because they had learned what had happened in 1640-50. But still, I think the question remains as to why he changed his mind so significantly on this question.
This comrade will be followed by the comrade right at the back.
Hi, I'm a school student. I'd just like to tell you a little story about what's happened in our history class. I mean, unfortunately, we haven't yet been able to study the English Revolution, but hopefully we will. But it's just about the transformation. You know, we started off a couple of years ago with sort of, 25, 14-year-olds, completely sort of, disillusioned, didn't really think that there was any way of fighting back against the system, and didn't bother with any kind of politics. And then we've done the suffragettes, and particularly the Russian Revolution, and over the course of time this has really transformed people's ideas. We've seen that we can fight back, people have done it in the past, and we can. And the result of this was in the end that the vast majority of my history class came out in the school strikes against the war, because they could see that other people had fought back and that they could do it too.
The comrade will be followed by the comrade at the front in the middle, who will be the last speaker.
It's more of a sort of question, really. The last comrade spoke about how he wasn't really taught about the English Revolution at school, and I too didn't really study the English Revolution at school. You learn about the French Revolution, you can learn about the Russian Revolution, but revolution is supposed to be this foreign thing that just happens in other countries. We don't actually don't worry about the English Revolution. It just doesn't really happen. English people don't revolt. Whatever, it just slips off the agenda, really. But the question really is more about the fact that revolutions, as they seem to progress through history, later revolutions seem to be far more international, really. I mean, Russia, revolution today, if it broke out in one country, for example, the internet, things like that, we've enabled it to be spread around the world. We had indie media talking about it. You'd be able to read about it, TV. You couldn't ignore that it happened. Russian Revolution as well, more so. But the English Revolution, I mean, because I didn't really study it, I didn't really know. I just wondered what sort of impact it had internationally. Was it just a great rebellion that took place in England, or was it failure of technology, the fact there wasn't any printing press, wasn't any books, things like that? I don't know, basically. It's a question. Did it spark? It didn't obviously spark any sort of interest in revolutionary ideas, any effect in other countries, really. I just wondered about that. And if it's just a thing, if it didn't, I don't know, if it's just a really, just quick point that I thought about. It's probably completely wrong and a terrible insult to Christopher Hill, in which case I apologise profusely. But it's just why I just wonder why he chose the English Revolution to study as a thing. Why did he choose that subject matter? I mean, was it that because it didn't spread, maybe because it didn't have that much impact internationally, it was more acceptable to be studying, really, coming from a sort of position where Stalin's and slight limitations that might have posed on him. It's easier to just talk about a revolution in one country that didn't happen and what happened to that. I don't know, it's an insult to Christopher Hill. I apologise for that, but I just basically, what impact did the English Revolution have internationally? I'll put it like that.
I just wanted to say some thoughts, because the discussion's got me thinking about the battle of history, and earlier this year, I'll start there. Earlier this year, I went to visit the Battlefield Museum at Naseby, and it's quite interesting. First of all, it's only open on, I think, a couple of bank holidays a year. The second thing about it, it's in a barn that's obviously thoroughly rotting with damp, and it's falling to pieces. And I think there's a reason for that, is that, for a start, English heritage don't want to preserve the memory of the English Revolution. I don't think it's accidental that, quite a decisive event in British history like that is being left to rot. And I think that is a consequence of what Walter Benjamin said about the battle of history, that it's been written by the victors, and to the victors belong the spoils, and they will carry off the whole cultural history if they can get away with it. And I think the fantastic achievement of people like Christopher Hill was to undermine that from within the academic system. Now, I think, went to Mark Steele's very exciting talk about the French Revolution last night, and it got me thinking that, we need this sort of history about the English Revolution as well. Not so much postmodern history, but post-punk history. I think we don't necessarily have to fight the bourgeoisie on the terrain that they choose. They choose to have the historical debate within the academy, and I think one of the jobs for socialists in the 21st century is to drag history out of the academy, and let's have a popular or even pop history of the English Revolution that actually ordinary workers can engage with, and then not abandoning any of the rigour that Christopher Hill brought to the subject, but that could be a starting point and opening a door for people in the battle for history.
Okay, I'm afraid it'll have to be the last speaker because we've run out of time. Just before John and then Brian respond to the discussion, just a couple of announcements. Firstly, that there's many books about the English Revolution on sale in bookmarks, including firstly by Brian himself, The Far Left in the English Revolution, and England's Turning Point by Christopher Hill. They're both published by bookmarks, but there's loads of different books by Christopher Hill as well. Second is an announcement about the video The Iguazu Effect, I don't know if I've said that right, which is about the occupation of central Madrid by Sintel workers, which is in the timetable to start at 2 o'clock, but is actually going to start at 1:30 p.m. today in the Palms room. So if you're planning to go to that, then you need to get there early. Okay, I'll bring back John and then Brian.
Okay, just a couple of points. I think the thing that Jon Gambit made, the last point in the discussion about the way in which the English Revolution is treated in this country is very instructive, actually, because if you compare, John's right, if you compare the way in which the battlefield sites are treated in this country compared to the battlefield sites of the American Civil War or the American Revolution in America, it's complete. You couldn't have a greater contrast between, say, Naseby and the site of the Gettysburg battle, which is, a huge open air museum, brilliantly preserved and all the rest of it. And that's because the ruling class deals with the revolutionary heritage by trying to incorporate it, because it's part of the Republican tradition in the United States, whereas the British ruling class tries to deal with it by excluding it and marginalising it. And that, in one sense, places a heavier responsibility on the left in this country to recover and establish and perpetuate the revolutionary tradition. Just one thing that one thing actually I like about the Cromwell film is that in an era, and I think the 17th century and the revolutionary era in particular is an era which is absolutely alive with the most extraordinary verbal and written expression. It's a period of real beauty in the English language, and one of the most, I think, affecting things ever said was said on the battlefield at Edge Hill, where one of the people about to do the fighting said, "O Lord, if I forget thee this day, do not thou forget me." And one of the most brilliant things about the Cromwell film is that takes it from the royalist who actually said it and gives this brilliant line completely wrongly to somebody on the parliamentarian side. One other point I'd like to make about the point that Neil Davidson raised about consciousness, and Hill makes this point, that the English Revolution was simply the first revolution of its type. They had no model or prototype. They had no theory. And to the degree that they did, they either developed it, as the participants in the Putney debate did, in the course of events, or drew it from the Norman yoke, and which one of Hill's brilliant essays is to show how various sort of pre-existing ideas or dreams of equality were brought to bear in the furnace of the revolution, or they brought it from the Bible itself. And his whole huge book is about how the Bible was used in part in this way. But he makes the point at the end of it that providential theory, the idea that providence was on your side, was an absolutely brilliant thing when things were going well, but a bit of a downer when they weren't, because when they were going well, it meant that God was on your side, and Cromwell made this point a number of times. But when things went bad, that was pretty damning as well, because it meant he was pretty firmly against you. And he makes the point that actually the use of the Bible for political purposes broke down at the end of the revolution on this inadequacy. And I think it's one example of the way that Hill was so insightful about these things. I think the revolution did have an international impact, though. Just one thing: in the course of the American Revolution in 1776, there were children being born to backwoods farmers who the boys were named Oliver, and it's a clear recognition that something had carried on from the English Revolution into the subsequent bourgeois revolutions. And the final thing I want to say is that I always think that completely, no doubt, without intention, there is the most magnificent monument to the revolution down in Whitehall, where the banqueting house exists, because if you go down there, you'll see the banqueting house. It was on a platform outside the banqueting house that Charles I was executed, had his head cut off, and the window through which he stepped onto the platform where he was executed no longer exists. It's been bricked up, but in its place there is a small hollow in the wall where the bust of Charles I has been located. So there is literally the disembodied head of Charles I at that point in Whitehall.
Christopher actually came to the 17th century via literature. It was his interest in 17th century literature, which is actually, curiously, inspired by T.H. Eliot. So all these works on Milton, Marvel, and so forth, these were actually really his starting point in the history. I'm not actually all that enamoured of preserving battlefields, because the thing that I found wrong with the teaching of history in schools and so forth, it always, in my day, was about bloody battles. And this is not actually all that important. You can make the comparison with Ireland, where not only every battlefield, every skirmish, every massacre is very carefully preserved. Most of these are complete myths. I mean, they're untrue. Site of massacre, nothing happened there. But it can get involved with nationalism in a big way, this preservation policy. Internationally, it's the timing that's very important. There were a series of revolts or revolutions in mid-17th century England, Catalonia, Naples, Palermo, so forth. These had enormous impact actually on England. The revolt of Masaniello in Naples is continuously referred to in England. It's reported in the newspapers in England. They followed these events on the continent. But by the time the English Revolution had won, the whole situation had changed. It was the question of England now has the most powerful army in Europe. It has the most powerful navy in Europe. It is asserting itself as a big power in Europe. So it's moved out of the revolutionary context of Masaniello and Naples and so forth. It is moved in the context of the big power leagues and so forth. So what you actually get internationally, why is Portugal called England's oldest ally? Portugal had broken away from Spain. Spain was unable to reconquer Portugal because Britain intervened on behalf of Portugal. So Britain was playing in a European league, and it wasn't playing in the politics of the sailors in Naples and so forth. I'm very struck actually about all these questions about teaching of history in the schools and in the universities. I mean, it is no doubt the case that early modern history of the English Revolution has largely actually been driven out of universities. But of course that's not entirely new. When I was a student, we didn't have any special subject on the English Revolution when I was a student. Although Christopher Hill was a leading teacher on the subject. But the preoccupation, and one finds a lot of with modern history, what I was trying to put across in the celebration of the English Revolution is that how modern the English Revolution is, how relevant it is to the present day. And I think that's what we have to try and stress, is the relevance of the English Revolution to our own times. Now, I failed to perform the Christopher Hill function of bringing it down, in a sense, to little people. And I just have one little vision that I would share with you. It's nothing to do with radicals or conservatives, but when the New Model Army advanced into the southwest of England, the farmers were very worried about being plundered by the soldiers. So there was this farmer on his own, took his musket and went out, and he confronted the entire New Model Army. And he actually cocked his musket, and the soldiers couldn't believe it. Here's this one man who is actually standing against us, and they had some difficulty in overpowering him. Now, those are the people in a way who mattered. Now, he wasn't actually on the side of the angels, he was protecting his own livelihood. But there were people who had this confidence to actually go out and stand up for themselves. And that again was I was trying to stress. And the slogan I would quote, which came to mind, the royalists said, if I forget you today, God, you don't forget me. The phrase that I remember is a chap who at Burford said, man was not born with a saddle on his back. And 50 years later, that same bloke, now an old man, is actually repeating the same. He's eventually executed a traitor. He's saying the same thing. But it was those sort of phrases that I think will matter.